Last time, we told you where he came from. A boy born into a country killing itself, put out onto the streets of Bogota by the age of 8 or 10, assaulted first by a stranger who promised him a bed, and later by a teacher who was supposed to be protecting him instead. We told you about the one good year at an orphan school, and about the door that closed right after it. And we told you about a prison cell where an 18-year-old who had just been gang raped by 4 older inmates picked up a knife he had made with his own hands and killed 3 of them, and where the system responsible for correcting him looked at all of that and shrugged. We asked you to hold on to that shrug. We told you it wasn't the last one you'd hear about. He walked out of that prison sometime around the age of 21, carrying a childhood nobody had ever addressed, and 3 killings nobody had ever meaningfully punished. He did not go home. There was no home left to go to. He went south instead, into Peru. This is where it starts. A rope wound around a young man's chest, pinning his arms to his sides. Sand packed by hand around his legs, then his waist, then rising past his ribs, while he is still very much alive to feel every fistful of it land. Above him, a circle of faces, men and women of an Ayacuchoan community high in the Peruvian Andes, people whose daughters have been disappearing for longer than anyone outside that community has bothered to notice, and who have finally, after years of it, caught the man responsible in the very act of taking one more. They are not calling the police. There is no reason yet, in this part of the world, for them to believe the police would come, let alone help. They are doing something considerably older than any police force in that country. They are burying a man alive, by hand, in the ground, and by every account of what tribal justice of this kind was meant to accomplish, they intend for it to take a while. He will survive this. We are telling you now, plainly, not to rob the moment of its weight, but so that what follows is not about whether he lives, he does, but about how and why, and at what continuing cost to every person he crosses paths with afterward. Keep this image with you: the rope, the sand rising past his ribs, the faces above him, waiting, some of them almost certainly the parents of a girl who never came home. We are going to come back to this moment more than once before this series is finished, and the last time we come back to it, it will mean something almost entirely different than it does right now. To understand how a young man from Bogota ended up buried to his neck in Peruvian sand, surrounded by people who very much wanted him dead, we have to go back. Not far this time, only a few years, to the day he walked out of a Colombian prison gate, carrying everything we told you about in our last episode, and carrying, in addition, something new. An appetite that had already begun to take a very specific shape inside him, though not one person watching him leave that gate had any way of knowing it. He traveled south, across a border, into a country he had no particular history with. The record does not give us a clean, single reason why Peru specifically drew him rather than anywhere else, and we are not in the business of inventing one just to make this story feel tidier than it was. What the record does show, beginning almost immediately and continuing for years without meaningful interruption, is a pattern. Young girls, overwhelmingly from poor or indigenous communities scattered across the Peruvian highlands, disappearing from market towns and roadside settlements, one at a time, in a country large enough and poor enough that one missing child rarely made it into a conversation with the next town over. It helps to understand something about the geography he was moving through, because it is not incidental to how long this went on. The Andean highlands of Peru in this era were, in many of the places he passed through, hours from the nearest police post, by roads that were not always roads so much as suggestions. Communication between towns depended on people, not wires. A disappearance in one village and a disappearance in a village 2 valleys over might as well have happened on different continents, for all the chance anyone had of connecting them. He was not hiding in plain sight, so much as he was hiding in distance itself, in the simple, structural fact that the state's ability to notice a pattern of violence dropped off sharply the further you traveled from a capital city. And he kept moving, always, before any single place had time to notice him twice. His method, by his own later account to interviewers, was almost insultingly simple, and its simplicity is precisely what makes it so effective. Then, and in every serial predator's story since, he would approach a child in a public space, a market stall, a roadside, a cluster of other children playing near a bus stop, and offer a small kindness, a coin, a trinket. Sometimes, he claimed, he told a girl he needed a guide, someone to show a stranger the way to a bus stop or a neighboring village, flattering a child into feeling useful and trusted, rather than making her feel like prey being stalked. He would walk her away from the crowd, unhurried, in full view of anyone who cared to look, because almost nobody who cared to look thought to be suspicious of a grown man simply walking somewhere with a child. And then, somewhere isolated, a riverbank, a stand of trees, a ravine off the main road, he would rape her and strangle her and leave. We are not going to narrate that sequence in any more detail than we have just given you. You understand by now, in this second episode, exactly what happened in those isolated places, over and over, for years. What matters for the rest of this hour is not the mechanics of the act. It is the scale of it, and it is the specific, deliberate, chosen cruelty behind who he decided was safe to do it to. He told interviewers years afterward that he avoided targeting white or wealthier children specifically because, in his words, loosely rendered across several separate retellings of the same interview, their parents were too watchful. We want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it may be the single clearest piece of evidence we have in this entire case for exactly how calculated his behavior was, from the very beginning of it. This was not a man losing control in a frenzy, seizing whichever child happened to be nearest. This was a man conducting something close to a standing risk assessment, village by village, market by market, deciding in advance whose absence would be searched for with resources and urgency, and whose absence would not be searched for much at all. And here is the thesis of this episode. The thing we told you at the start of this series, we would say to you plainly, once, and mean it. Pedro López did not get away with what he did in Peru because he was clever. He got away with it because he correctly understood, faster and more coldly than any single police department in 3 countries managed to understand it, that a poor indigenous girl going missing from a highland market town would not be treated by the authorities meant to protect her as a crime scene in progress. It would be filed, if it was filed anywhere at all, as one more runaway, or absorbed into the much larger, much vaguer, and much more politically convenient explanation of a regional trafficking trade that nobody in a position of power had the resources, or frankly the will, to investigate properly. He was not smarter than the system. He simply understood, with total clarity, exactly how little the system valued the children he had decided to take. He would later claim a number for this stretch of his life. More than 100 girls, by his own account, killed in Peru alone across these years. We are going to be exactly as careful here as we told you at the outset we would be. That number comes entirely from him. It was never tested in a Peruvian courtroom because Peru never once charged him with anything related to it. There is no Peruvian body count to weigh his claim against, because there was, functionally, no sustained Peruvian investigation into a serial killer during the years he says he was active there. All we can tell you with any real confidence is this: for years, in a country that never once caught him, an unknown number of girls, a number that may be close to what he claimed, or may be considerably smaller, and which we simply cannot verify in either direction, stopped coming home, and their disappearances were absorbed one by one into a larger, ongoing, undifferentiated tragedy of missing children that nobody was tracking closely enough to notice the pattern threaded through it. It is worth asking, for a moment, what it would have taken for someone to notice that pattern in time. Not extraordinary heroism, not a genius detective. It would have taken, simply, a system that treated a missing Indigenous child with the same institutional urgency as a missing child from a wealthy neighborhood in Lima. A single shared list, updated and cross-referenced across provinces, of the kind that seems obvious in hindsight, and that did not meaningfully exist. That is not a flaw unique to Peru in this era. It is close to the central mechanism of this entire case, in 3 different countries, across 2 decades. We will see the same failure again, in a different form, before this series ends. That is what makes the ending of this chapter of his life so strange, and so worth sitting with before we move on. It was not a police investigation that finally caught up with him in Peru. There was no task force. There was no detective assigned to a growing case file. No break that came from forensic evidence or a tip line. It was a single community acting entirely on its own, doing for itself in an afternoon what no government agency in 3 countries would manage to do for years afterward. Sometime in this period, Lopez approached a 9-year-old girl in an Ayacuchoan community, attempting the same routine that had worked for him so many times before in so many other places. The small kindness, the offer to walk her somewhere just out of sight. This time, for the first time in years, it did not work. The record does not tell us with any precision whether this was because the community had already, quietly, connected a string of earlier disappearances to a stranger matching his description, watching and waiting for him to come back, or whether something in that particular moment simply gave him away to people who happened to be close enough to see it. What the record does tell us, clearly, is that this time, someone saw exactly what was happening, in time to stop it before it went any further. They took him. And, notably, they did not take him to the police first. This is the burial we open this episode with. A group of men and women, almost certainly grieving daughters, nieces, and neighbors of their own. People who had spent years watching their community's girls vanish with no help coming from anywhere outside it, stripped him, beat him, and put him in the ground alive, up to his neck, by his own account, left under the open sky to die slowly rather than quickly at anyone's hand, which is itself its own statement about exactly what they believed he had earned. There is no police report from this moment. There is no photograph. Everything we know about it comes down, in the end, to the same source as so much of this story, Lopez himself, recounting it later in an interview to a journalist, framing his own near execution as one more dramatic chapter in the story of his survival, rather than as a moment when an entire community correctly identified exactly what he was and very nearly ended it there, permanently, before he could take a single other life. We are telling you his version because it is the only detailed version that exists. We want you to notice, as we tell it, that even here, buried to his neck, hours from death, the story is still being told to us on his terms. We are not going to romanticize this as justice finally arriving in the nick of time. It was, very nearly, an execution carried out by people who had every conceivable reason in the world to want him dead. And if it had gone that way, this would be a considerably shorter, and in some ways, a considerably simpler story than the one you are listening to. It did not go that way because of one more person entering the frame at exactly the wrong moment, depending entirely on your point of view. An American missionary present in the region who came upon the scene already in progress and intervened, persuading the community to hand Lopez over to the authorities instead of letting the sand finish what it had already started. We do not know this missionary's name. We do not know exactly what was said in that moment to change the minds of people who had every reason in the world not to listen to an outsider telling them to spare the man who had been taking their children for years. We can guess at the reasoning: an appeal to law over vengeance, a promise that the authorities would finish what the community had started, a belief, however misplaced it would turn out to be, that handing him over was the more civilized choice. We know only the outcome. Lopez was dug back out of the ground, alive, and turned over to police. And the authorities who received him did not prosecute him for a single one of the killings he was suspected of. He was, so far as the record shows, simply expelled from the area, removed from that particular community's reach, and eventually pushed out of the country entirely. With no Peruvian trial, no Peruvian conviction, and no formal accounting in any courtroom on earth for however many girls he had actually killed there. Say that back to yourself, slowly, because it is the exact same shape as the ending of our very first episode, and it will not be the last time you hear this particular shape before this series is over. A community did, with its own hands, what an entire country's legal system could not or would not do. It caught him, in the act, with no ambiguity whatsoever about his guilt. And the outcome was not justice. It was a missed execution, followed almost immediately by a shrug from the people whose actual sworn job it was to hold him accountable, followed by Pedro López simply walking away again, this time across a border, into a country that had absolutely no idea yet what was about to arrive on its own soil. 3 shrugs now, if you're counting. A Colombian prison in the first episode, an Ecuadorian border checkpoint waiting for him further down this same road, though we haven't reached it yet. And now, Peru, a country that had a man in custody who had just been caught mid-abduction by an entire community willing to testify to exactly what he was, and that chose, instead of prosecution, simple removal. Push him over the border. Let him become someone else's problem. It is worth naming, plainly, what that policy actually cost. Not an abstraction, but a specific and countable number of children in the next country who would still be alive if Peru had done anything else with him at all. He carried the sand of that near grave with him, we imagine, the way anyone would carry something like that. He did not carry a single lesson from it that changed his behavior in any way that mattered. He went next into Colombia, and then into Ecuador, into the one country of the three where the disappearances would finally, after years of accumulating in silence, start to add up in someone's mind as something other than trafficking. Into the country where a flash flood of all improbable things would end up doing what no detective in 3 nations had managed in years of near misses: pull the truth bodily up out of the ground where he had buried it, and force an entire country to finally look. That is where we are going to pick up next time.